This is week 2 of Existentialism. In this lecture, I'm going to look at a couple of issues that come up in the text from last week that I think illuminate what we're doing this week. So first, in Stages on Life's Way, in addition to outlining the 3 spheres of existence, Kierkegaard identifies 3 different kinds of sophist. So Kierkegaard explains that a sophist is someone who thinks she's religious, but fails to be religious because of having a one-sided understanding of what it means to be religious. So for Kierkegaard, the 3 ways of being a sophist are aesthetic, ethical, and metaphysical. So the thought is you could either identify religion with a certain kind of pleasure, right? So you could take pleasure in religious rituals and think you're religious in virtue of taking that kind of pleasure. So that would be an aesthetic sophist. An ethical sophist identifies the religious with the ethical. So this sort of person thinks being religious just consists in following a certain set of obligations. And the third kind of sophist, Kierkegaard explains, is someone who identifies the religious with the metaphysical. Right, so this sort of sophist has a belief about the existence of God or a belief about the structure of the universe. And according to this kind of sophist, being religious just consists in holding those sorts of metaphysical beliefs about what there is. It's significant that Kierkegaard writes, of these sophists, I am one. So that's sort of surprising. Is Kierkegaard a sophist? So here I think it's important to bring up an issue that I didn't talk about last time, that all the texts that we're reading for this course are written pseudonymously. So Stages on Life's Way are studies by various persons, compiled, forwarded to the press, and published by Hilarious Bookbinder. Either or are letters between A and B, edited by Victor Eremita. And Fear and Trembling is a dialectical lyric by Johannes di Silentio, or Silent John. So what's the point of this? What's the point of Kierkegaard writing under these pseudonyms? The point of the pseudonym seems to be to create a certain distance between the author and the text. And by the same measure, a distance between the reader and the text. So the worry here is there's a certain way of relating the author to the text or the reader to the text that inevitably results in sophistry. And so what we need to do is learn how to understand Kierkegaard's use of pseudonyms so that we see how he avoids being a sophist in his authorship, and also how we can avoid having a sophistical understanding of the texts as readers. So another theme that came up last time, that we'll be discussing this time, next time as well, is despair. So on pages 78 and 79 of Either Or, Kierkegaard draws a comparison between doubt and despair. He suggests that doubt stands in the same relation to thought that despair stands to personality. Now, despair is the name of the problem that comes up in the ethical life, that can't be solved in the ethical life itself, but can be solved only in the religious life. So in this way, despair is the key point in the argument that the religious life is a better way of living than the ethical life. So what's despair? If we try to use the analogy with doubt, we can think, if there's a belief that I hold that comes to be undermined, then I come to doubt the content of that belief. So by the same token, if there's a person that I've made myself through my ethical choice making, and that person comes to be undermined, despair is the attitude I now hold toward that person, the person I used to be and the person who I made myself. Right, so just as doubt is giving up on a belief I previously held, despair is giving up on a person that I previously was, and a person that I was because I became that person through my ethical choices. Now, faith, Kierkegaard tells us at the beginning of Fear and Trembling, is the overcoming of despair. I think that we often conceive of faith as belief with a lack of evidence, right? So if I can't prove that God exists, so I can't know that God exists, but but I still believe that God exists, like in the absence of proof or in the absence of any positive evidence. We often call that faith. We often say, well, that's what it is to have faith in the existence of God. And so this is the sort of understanding of faith that Kierkegaard wants to guard against. Faith shouldn't be the overcoming of doubt, but instead the overcoming of despair. This is why Kierkegaard says that in faith, we are infinitely concerned with ourselves. He says that in Stages on Life's Way. Or he says, in faith, I choose myself in either or. So one way we have to understand faith is as the overcoming of despair. We can think, if we understand the problem of despair, then faith is just whatever it takes to solve that problem. The other way Kierkegaard gives us of understanding what faith is by his reflection in Fear and Trembling on the character of Abraham. So the story of Abraham is that he's the leader of God's chosen people, and he is commanded by God to kill his son Isaac as a sacrifice in a mountain in a land called Moriah. Now, Abraham agrees to God's command, travels to Moriah, and is about to sacrifice his son Isaac when God intervenes and tells Abraham that he can substitute a ram for Isaac. A crucial feature of this story for Kierkegaard is that when God allows Abraham to substitute the ram for his son Isaac in the sacrifice, Abraham immediately rallies to joy. This immediate feeling of joy that Kierkegaard thinks distinguishes Abraham from a different sort of figure, a figure that Kierkegaard calls a tragic hero, or a knight of infinite resignation. The joy is what makes Abraham, by contrast, a knight of faith. So a tragic hero, by contrast, is a figure like Agamemnon. Kierkegaard recounts the story of Agamemnon in the unabridged version of this text. We have the abridged version. But the basic idea is that Agamemnon is the leader of the Achaeans against the Trojans in the Trojan War. And because Agamemnon has offended the goddess Artemis, he is commanded to sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia. And now, what makes Agamemnon a tragic hero is that he behaves ethically. Agamemnon acts rationally. He understands that the right thing for him to do, as the leader of the Achaeans, is to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia, and he thinks that's going to be terrible. Right? He thinks he'll be miserable, but a just leader. So Abraham is not a tragic hero, but a figure of faith, because he doesn't just act ethically or rationally, but he acts religiously. What Kierkegaard does is he carries out God's command, and he expects it to lead to happiness. So Kierkegaard expects to be joyful after completing God's command. And so this is why, upon substituting the ram for Isaac, Abraham is able to immediately feel joy. He expected things to end up with his happiness, and he did receive happiness. Now, it's important that for Abraham, this was not a rational expectation. There was no reason to think that sacrificing Isaac would lead to Abraham's happiness. Instead, Abraham expected happiness by virtue of the absurd. Okay, so this is what I want you to think about in working on your essays this week. What does it mean to have faith by virtue of the absurd? And how is it that having faith by virtue of the absurd enables Abraham or anyone to overcome despair, which is understood as the negation of one's personality? So what I want you to do is give me a fuller and more detailed account of what faith is, what makes Abraham a figure of faith, and what in general a figure of faith is.